I'm Vincent Miller, the Dudorf Chair in Catholic Theology and Culture. Before getting started with our first keynote and respondent, allow me to make a few logistical announcements. So today we'll be in this space for our keynotes and responses, and after those we'll be breaking out into smaller dialogue groups which are throughout the building. You can find the number of your group on the back of your name badge, and the location of the groups can be found inside the back cover of your program book. Also, on the back of your name badge, you can find what food events you are registered to attend. Those of you who are not able to register for lunch because it's already been filled, you can put your names on a waiting list for reward. And please do, because catering provides an abundance, so don't feel that you're necessarily left out. Please make sure you put your name on the list. We hope to be able to include as many people as possible in the meal as we can. Coffee and tea are available in the atrium throughout the day, as you've seen. Those of you who are to join us for lunch will be walking to Kennedy Union, which is about a 5-minute walk away. If you would like a golf cart ride to the location, we can arrange that, and please again speak with Lori Eva. If you will not be back on Sunday, please, when you are leaving the conference, please consider dropping your badge holder in the basket by the door so we can recycle them, and also so we can know who's coming back and who's not. So keeping your name tag tells us you'll be back Sunday. All right, so on to the substance of our work together. We begin the second very full day of our conference seeking to engage and continue the work of Brother Ray Fitz. I've known Brother Ray for a little more than 10 years, and during that time I've been struck by his abiding commitment to one question, which I think he asked me the first time I met him. Born from his work with members of the Dayton community, how do we develop regional solidarity? And those of you who know Brother Ray understand his questions are practical, not theoretical. Right? When he says, how do we develop regional solidarity, he wants an answer from you, and he wants you to help do that. And so we've tried to make this conference, model this conference on the nature of Brother Ray's questions and concerns. So we have keynotes. When we invited the speakers, we have 3 wonderful speakers. We stressed with them that we want you to come and give presentations. Those presentations are to spur dialogue, and we'll have those breakout sessions, and then the keynote speakers will participate in those breakout sessions. So we're trying to model Brother Ray's understanding of the intellectual life and community life, right? So this is leading to organization. This is leading to the conversation we're having Sunday. Brother Ray's question reveals his commitment to the place of Dayton, his deep awareness and concern about its inequalities and injustices, his trust that the Catholic social tradition has something to offer in response. And so this conference aims to engage all 3 dimensions: awareness, concern, and response. If you are here, you certainly bring something of each of those with you. So thankful that you come. When it comes to awareness, we face a special collective problem, not just individual. So much of what divides us is built invisibly into the spaces in which we live, into municipal and jurisdictional boundaries, into the highways which connect and divide us, into decades-old housing policies that undergird our experiences of prosperity and poverty, opportunity and limited options. The key problem here is these constructions of space are hidden from many, including many who personally oppose their injustices, who would never avow the politics that are built into our spaces. The spaces do that to us. How do we unearth what's being done? How do we unearth it so we can respond to it? So there's much work to be done in excavating these histories and illuminating the politics of our spaces. For members of religious communities, there's additional work to do. Not only do we hold deeds to property and work and shop and travel in this divided region like everyone else, we also attend churches and congregations which preach about justice and community, about being together at the table. These same communities have so often consented to this racialized division of our city. And indeed, religious communities have been active protagonists. Some religious communities have been active protagonists in those divisions. The Catholic Church in particular which has much to say about space and community. A profound theology of place has a long history of complicity in those racial divisions. Whatever that history, today, whatever our awareness of that history, today, the Catholic Church, in its structure, seems to consent to those divisions and accept those spatial divides as the space in which you might have to conduct life. Our first keynote speaker, Dr. Maureen O'Connell, chair of the Department of Religion and associate professor of Christian ethics at Salle University, is someone who has worked hard to uncover and face this complicity. Her latest work, Undoing the Knots, 5 Generations of American Catholic Anti-Blackness, excavates her Catholic family's entanglements with race and racism from the time they immigrated to America to the present, tracing by implication how the larger Catholic population became white, and why, despite the tenets of their faith, so many white Catholics have lukewarm commitments to racial justice at best. Dr. O'Connell's previous works include Compassion, Loving Our Neighbor in an Age of Globalization, and If These Walls Could Talk, Community Muralism and the Beauty of Justice. She is a member of St. Vincent de Paul Parish in Germantown, Pennsylvania, and is also a member of POWER, Philadelphians Organizing to Witness, Empower, and Rebuild. POWER is an interfaith federation of 90 faith communities committed to making Philadelphia the city of just love, as well as brotherly and sisterly affection. Through a more just wage for workers, fair funding for public schools, immigration reform, and decarceration. The title of her presentation is Remembering to Remember Catholic Racism and the Common Good. Responding will be Darryl Fairchild, Methodist minister, manager of chaplain services at Dayton Children's Hospital, and City of Dayton commissioner. Growing up in Dayton, Darryl's understanding of race relations were formed profoundly by the community's response to mandatory school busing when he was in 5th grade. This experience in part led to his call to ministry and to doctoral studies in personality and religion with a focus on race relations. His research has explored questions of how white racial identity is formed, how white Christians reconcile cognitive dissonance, love of neighbor, and racist beliefs, how racial narratives are changed, and how white racial allies are formed. As you can see, the structure of the conference again tries to embody brotherly race concern. We have speakers coming in to present their research and their scholarship, and we have local respondents from the community engaging and making connections to Dayton. So I ask you to welcome Dr. O'Connell.
Thank you, Vince, very much for that warm welcome, and thanks very much for the invitation to be here, and thanks to all of the folks who are hopefully in their pajamas with coffee at home on Zoom, which includes my mother, Kathleen, in Philadelphia. She's not in her pajamas, she's been up for hours, but anyway, I'm glad you're here. Congratulations to Brother Ray on your much deserved honor that recognizes your commitment to insisting that the University of Dayton, its resources, but more importantly, its people, contribute to regional solidarity of the Dayton metropolitan area. And I want to also thank Darryl Fairchild for your work in that regard, but also for the attention you've given my ideas. I look forward to our conversation. So to set the stage for my comments this morning, I want to begin with a story. I want to begin with my earliest memory of racism. One mid-May evening in 1985, when I was just 12 and my sister Corinne only 10, my dad roused us from sleep and drove us, still in our pajamas, to a hill not a half a mile from our home. He helped us climb up on a picnic table, probably right on the border between Philadelphia and our suburban town of Elkins Park, and pointed out an orange glow in the sky. A few hours earlier, Philadelphia police had dropped a bomb on a roof of a row home in a West Philadelphia neighborhood in an attempt to evacuate members of a back to nature cult called Move, with whom they had been in a decades-long standoff. The Move compound, as it was called by local media, caught fire. But since the fire commissioner gave the command initially to stand down, So did an entire block of Black-owned homes in that neighborhood. 11 people died, 5 of them children. 61 houses burned to the ground, and 250 residents were displaced. While moves back to nature, lifestyle, and bullhorned propaganda certainly undermined the common good of the neighborhood with public health violations, noise, and antagonistic stances towards their neighborhoods, the Philadelphia Police and Fire Department's disproportionately violent and indiscriminate response violated the common good of the whole city. Most Black residents knew that it could just as easily have been their home that was burned to the ground in the name of protecting law and order as the Philadelphia Police Department understood it. Most white residents, especially those like the O'Connells, safely ensconced in inner ring suburbs, which in the mid-1980s were still predominantly white, could rest easier knowing that their parents and their grandparents had made the right decision in leaving their city neighborhoods a generation earlier. They also probably knew that few, if any, city or public servants involved in the standoff that day or the fire that resulted would face criminal charges, signaling that the criminal justice system was still stacked in their white favor. Those predictions were right. Perhaps more importantly for the focus of our time together, the silence of Philadelphia's Catholic community, surely robustly represented among police and firefighters on the scene that day, but also woven into the fabric of parishes and schools in that West Philadelphia neighborhood, not to mention a variety of social service agencies tasked with supporting the well-being of some of the city's most vulnerable citizens, also undermined the common good. Instead of condemning the violence, lamenting the loss of life and homes, offering sources for reconciliation and rituals for healing, Catholic leaders remained silent. So did my dad, my pastor, my teachers, my professors. I witnessed the move tragedy from a distance and then was tucked back into my bed, a great metaphor for the ultimate privilege afforded to white people in our racialized society and church, to witness horror and then turn back to our comfort zones, to go back to sleep. In fact, in all of my years of Catholic schooling, 4 of them at St. Joseph's University, less than 5 miles from the West Philadelphia neighborhood that burned to the ground, we never spoke of the move bombing and fire. But even in the silence, a variety of questions still swirl in the Catholic Archdiocese of Philadelphia more than 30 years after the move bombing. How valued are some neighborhoods? Who determines the goods of life and community? To whom are public servants and faith leaders accountable? How connected do people really feel to one another? In my time this morning, I want to unpack this central claim. Remembering and examining the history of racism within the Catholic Church helps us to see the limits of our common good tradition, both how Catholics, particularly white Catholics, have narrowly understood and applied this central principle of Catholic social teaching. Remembering this history will also help us untangle this central principle and, more importantly, the practices associated with it from the knots of racism within many Catholic communities, like my own in Philadelphia, or yours here in Dayton. I'm intentional with my verb choice here, remembering, because while the history of racism with the church may be new to some of us, especially those of you who are white like me, there's certainly nothing new about it for the peoples of color who experience this pain, the pain of this history on a regular basis. Like many things connected to racism, it's a history hidden in plain sight, and hidden seems to be a word that we're hearing quite a lot already. Memories of racism within the church are what political theologians call dangerous memories because they have the power to interrupt the way we see the world, ourselves, and our church in the present moment. We remember to recognize historical impulses showing up in our present realities. Those interruptions can open us up to different paths towards a more just future, especially if we acknowledge the experiential wisdom of those who have been impacted by a history of racism in the church. And I think that Brother Ray understands this idea very clearly, both in light of comments he made last night, but that he once made about turning to face the suffering of people who have been made poor. I quote him here, "These experiences have been a gift, a painful gift that has allowed me to see the face of God in a new way," he said on his Golden Jubilee in 2010. In encountering God this way, we can begin to remember, put back together the common good, to link it to the notion of communion that racism works to preclude. So I'm going to name a few ways in which remembering and examining the dangerous memory of the history of racism within the Catholic Church can sharpen or deepen or even expand our understanding of the common good in our current reality and motivate us to commit to it in new ways in urban contexts, again, like my own in Philadelphia or yours here in Dayton. And that's clearly the work over the next couple hours and into tomorrow. So first, let me start by giving you a little bit of a sense of how I understand two terms, and sorry if this is making everybody motion sick, two terms right at the heart of my thesis: racism and the common good. So I appreciate Ibram Kendi's approach to defining racism, since it allows me to use a Catholic both and frame. For Kendi, racism is both individual in that it entails personal attitudes or beliefs or assumptions which reflect that there is something wrong with people of color, particularly Black people. But it is also structural in that these ideas shape the way we distribute social goods, which in turn impact our perceptions not only of reality, but also of ourselves. So he talks about ideas giving rise to policies that shape people, that reinforce ideas. So there is this sort of cyclical nature to racism for Kendi. Since it's both individual and structural, I also am very compelled by Dr. Kamara Phyllis-Jones's conclusion about racism as a Christian ethicist. And she says the moral imperative where racial justice is concerned is not to determine whether racism is operative in most of our social systems, but to really hone in on how it is at work. So the examples I'll share shortly, I'm going to build on these baseline definitions. The second set of things I'd like to talk with you about, and actually I think I went too far, so let me see if I can just bring it back. One. Oh no, we're going in the wrong direction. I think that I was clicking back, yeah. But it doesn't. Here we go. Sorry, everybody. Close your eyes. This is the big one. Hold it. Here we go. Apologies. So let's go. Now we're going to go forward. Again, don't get. Okay, unfortunately, I can't, I'll leave it there for the sake of time. So let's talk about the common good really quickly. I had some neat images of three popes who had all been declared Men of the Year. Interesting phrasing, except for Pope Francis, who was the Person of the Year on Time magazine. So let's just quickly talk about the common good. John the 23rd's definition from his encyclical Mater Magistra offers an important foundation. He says the common good is, quote, the sum conditions of our social living, whereby persons are enabled more fully and readily to achieve their own perfection. Here, the Pope pulls on a theological anthropology at the heart of the Catholic social tradition. Human beings are social creatures. We are created for relationship in which we flourish, and care of the neighbor is an obligation that we have, and that life and community is a primary good. 4 ideas about the common good from John the 23rd. He then links it to human rights, knowing that human rights are not simply freedoms from others infringing on my distinctively human capabilities of speech or religious expression or owning property, and certainly not when those claims of freedom violate what he calls the limits of the moral order and the common good. But really, rights are freedoms to meet the obligations I have to ensure my neighbors can flourish too, right? And so he says, and I quote him, a person's dignity involves the right to take an active part in the common welfare of their fellow citizens. St. John Paul II developed that common good tradition by connecting it to the dignity of work, which allows us to participate in and contribute to life and community. As well, for John Paul II, the common good is linked to solidarity. We heard about that last night, right? Which emboldens a sense of co-responsibility that defies the boundaries that separate us. I'm going to quote John Paul II. When interdependence becomes recognized in this way, the correlative response as a moral and social attitude, as a virtue, is solidarity. He goes on to say, this is then not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people, both far and near. On the contrary, it is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, to the good of all and each individual, because we really all are responsible for all. End quote from John Paul II. Most recently, in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis amplified that affective or emotional dimension of the common good with his concept of social love, noting, and I quote him, when we love and generate creativity, when we generate trust and solidarity, it is then that concrete initiatives for the common good emerge. So creativity, trust, and solidarity are the preconditions for the common good, according to Pope Francis. In this way, the common good is akin to a social bond towards which we are to direct our energies and around which we are to build our political and social orders. And here's Pope Francis. It's one thing to feel forced to live together, he says, but something entirely different to value the richness and the beauty of those seeds of common life that ought to be sought out and cultivated. So some ideas about the relational and structural dimensions, both of racism and the common good. So with that in mind, let me share some dangerous memories that I remember through examining 5 generations of my American Catholic family's entanglement in the color line, and how racism distorts our understanding of what the common good is and how it functions. So you've been looking at this for a while, the big reveal has already happened. So here's our first example. Catholic racism and a distorted common good. The United States celebrated its 150th birthday, the sesquicentennial, or sesqui as it was known, at a World's Fair in Philadelphia from May through November 1926. It was a moment to showcase the city, and the head of the Catholic Archdiocese at the time, Cardinal Joseph Doherty, did not want to miss an opportunity to exhibit Catholic prominence, especially in light of threatening rhetoric about him from the head of the Philadelphia's clavern of the KKK. So let's cross our fingers and hope that this is going to work. Yeah, it did. Philadelphia's so there was threatening rhetoric about him from the head of Philadelphia's clavern of the KKK, and KKK violence had targeted a Catholic church in a suburban parish earlier that June, in the same year of the Sesqui celebration. Philadelphia's Black communities were also eager to showcase their contributions to the American experiment, although they met with much resistance in trying to do so from the Sesqui organizing committee. This stands in stark contrast to the KKK, who did not meet resistance from that committee. Their proposal to hold a convocation with a march and a rally were only rejected at the last minute as a result of pressure from elite Jewish businessmen on the organizing committee. Black Catholics, however, looking to contribute to the Sesqui celebration had to clear 2 hurdles: the organizing committee and the cardinal. In looking through Doherty's papers, I came across a letter written by 3 ladies of St. Peter Claver Parish, the first of 6 colored national parishes in Philadelphia, established in 1892, seeking the cardinal's permission to contribute to the Catholic exhibit at the Sesqui. Doherty's reply, and you can see it sort of in pencil here once, and then again, the ladies were persistent and they wrote him a typed letter the second time, reflects the way in which they and other Black Catholics were cut off from the common celebration, from the common life of the church, and from the common good. In case you can't read it, it says, these people are to be told that the Archbishop does not intend to take a hand in this matter. More unsettling was Dr. Doherty's Sesqui plan for Catholic Philadelphia. One of the final events of the fair, not to mention the most highly attended, was a giant outdoor mass for 250,000 in the Sesqui Stadium, with an overflow mass for 50,000 who could not get in. Doherty orchestrated a march of 80,000 Catholic men down Broad Street to the Sesqui Stadium that October morning. They were grouped by parish, with the 6 Black parishes identified as colored. You're going to see it here, and maybe there's going to be an arrow, but in case there's not, I'm not going to click forward. Maybe you can see the little C in parentheses on those internal documents. They were grouped by their racial identity and situated in the way that he laid everybody out in towards the back of the procession and therefore the seating area in the Sesqui Stadium. It was a remarkable display of Catholic identity and assertion of Catholic centrality to the common good of Philadelphia, not to mention the nation in light of the themes of the homily. But to my mind, Doherty's spectacle mimicked the very style of the convocation that the Klan had been denied. In fact, the Cardinal performed Catholic supremacy in a city with a long history of anti-Catholicism. But his treatment of Black Catholics in the midst of it all, he performed Catholic white supremacy precisely at a time when KKK threats could have motivated meaningful solidarity among white and Black Catholics in Philadelphia and positioned the church to play a prophetic role in supporting an integrated common good across the city. Granted, this memory of Catholic Philadelphia occurred before the principle of the common good officially became part of the lexicon of Catholic social teaching. Oh, there they are. There's my arrow. Sorry, everybody, but you can see the clustering of parishes. So let's talk about how this is a reflection of the distortion of the common good. I still think it points to racialized understandings of life and community that likely undermined the receptions of the teaching of the common good, which would be promulgated 20 years later, and reflects more contemporary understandings of the common good today. So we're going to make 3 points here. First, since racism perpetuates our consciousness of race as the primary facet of human identity, racism reduces commonality to skin type. In other words, in a race-conscious society, we tend to believe that people of different races just naturally like or prefer to stick together. This facilitates de facto racism, or the sense that racial groupings are largely a result of natural inclinations, personal preferences, individual choices. Moreover, since racism creates hierarchies among racial groups, not only are the social inequalities experienced by different racial groups also perceived as natural or the result of individual choice, but goods created in racial groups are not perceived as equal, and access to those commonly created goods that are perceived to be better are protected. In short, racism reduces the common good to something created and enjoyed by people who look the same, as opposed to something that has universal appeal and unfettered access. So where does this show up in the church? The history of creating national parishes for European ethnic groups, especially groups whose assimilation to whiteness was not as easy as others, think here Italians or Polish Catholics, it is an example of a racialized common good. Ethnic parish enclaves generated goods, material and relational, which facilitated the flourishing of their members. However, the decision to maintain that national parish structure for Black Catholics, long after German or Polish or Italian ethnic parishes yielded to the mixing pot approach in American Catholicism, which for most of us in East Coast cities like Philadelphia meant assimilating to an Irish American Catholicism, it is evidence of what I call de magistra racism. In other words, in cities like Philadelphia, Black Catholics were contained in Black-only parishes created under the guise of de facto racism. Black Catholics would just prefer to worship together. But in truth, these national colored parishes were created because Black Catholics were not welcomed in white parishes, were not invited to share in the goods of life in whiter Catholic communities, and were contained in Black parishes by diocesan policies. Remembering the Sesqui, we are interrupted by the memory of already segregated Catholic parishes being further segregated within the Sesqui march down Broad Street. How might my family's notion of the common good been changed if my great-grandfathers and granduncles, surely in the throng that day, had walked shoulder to shoulder with Black Catholic men from around the Archdiocese? Facing this history, we are disrupted by the memory of Cardinal Doherty's refusal to even meet with 3 women from St. Peter Claver Parish, much less support whatever contribution they had hoped to make to the Catholic celebration of the Sesqui, even as he knew that Black people and surely Black Catholics were targets of the KKK in his own diocese that very spring. We're invited to think of a different future for the church if we allow ourselves to ponder how these Black women's contributions might have changed our thinking about the common good, or how a willingness on the part of white Philadelphia Catholics to see their contribution as part of our Catholicism may have also changed our commitment to the common good. Second, and this is something that Vince alluded to in his opening remarks, racism creates a space-bound understanding of the commons, or the physical spaces in which we come together to experience life and community, where we create and share the goods we need to flourish. In other words, as a result of racism, the common good gets tethered to particular spaces determined by what urban sociologist Elijah Anderson calls, and I quote him, the social border of skin color. Racism in the church, most notably in the territorial approach to parish life that pervaded the experience of American Catholicism through most of the 20th century, created a sense that the common good is geographically or a place-bound reality inhabited by people who are more inwardly focused on maintaining it than outwardly committed to growing it. Racism within the Catholic Church lent itself to a competitive and defensive posturing among members of Catholic communities, certainly among white Catholics ourselves, so tied to shoring up the viability of our own Catholic parishes, schools, and even universities. Catholic preoccupation with the physical space of the parish also perpetuated an obliviousness to the way in which those particular spaces or territories were embedded in a larger social ecosystem or realities beyond those enclaves. Surely the sesqui was monumental, if only because it exposed Philadelphia Catholics to the breadth of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, which they often lost sight of because of their preoccupation with maintaining the common good of their own parish. But Catholic experiences in racially segregated parishes or Catholic experiences of the sesqui reinforces Anderson's claim that, and I quote him, in public, white skin color is most often associated with respectability, civility, and trust, and Black skin color is associated with poverty, danger, and distrust, end quote. So Blackness becomes a liability to the common good when the common good is so tethered to white spaces. Church authorities, from priests to cardinals, intended to keep Black Catholics away from white parishes because of the perceived threats Black Catholics presented to the common good of our white and insulated and homogenous Catholic communities. So in some ways, it's no wonder many white American Catholics struggle with the principle of the preferential option for those made poor, since for at least 3 generations, the common good has been associated with what I call a preferential option for the institutional church. A moral calculus that protects the institutional church, whether that's the parish or the healthcare system or the university, in the name of also protecting all the good that institutional church does in and for a variety of communities that, particularly in urban contexts, it has ironically separated itself from when it comes to building communities of faith. So given Cardinal Dockery's practice of maintaining colored parishes whose boundaries were not territorial but corporal, we must allow ourselves to be made uneasy by the memory that he likely dismissed the St. Peter Claver's ladies' offer to assist with the exhibit in order to keep it white. We are left pondering what other offerings Black Catholics have been dismissed out of hand and how our sense of life and community has been diminished as a result. Remembering the Catholic racism of the sesqui should unsettle us, given the imperviousness of Catholic leadership to the double threat that Black Catholics surely felt during the height of KKK activity in Philadelphia, not to mention around the country. This memory also underscores the courage of Black Catholics who did join the march down Broad Street and their loyalty to the Catholic faith, despite leaders who were not loyal to them. I can't help but think of Dockery's missed opportunity during that sesqui period to acknowledge Black-led movements for racial justice and equality within the church, emerging out of Black Catholic communities who, unlike their white counterparts, transcended the parameters and space of parishes to which they did their advocating. I can't help but wonder if the ladies of St. Peter Claver, for example, were connected to the Federated Colored Catholics, founded in Washington, D.C. in 1925, but which quickly grew to a national movement agitating for equity, primarily in Catholic schools beyond their own parish enclaves. To my mind, the FCC offers a prophetic vision of the common good since it transcended parish boundaries, interrogated racialized boundaries of belonging, and modeled power with, rather than power over people in building the common good. It makes me wonder if we are paying attention to their predecessors, or excuse me, their successors. Finally, Racism privileges and even protects the comfort of those with the preferred skin type, even when that comfort comes at the expense of longer term and communal well-being. I suspect we're going to hear more about this from Dr. Edwards later today. Most of us today are familiar with the phrase white privilege, or the unearned entitlements afforded to people who are able to identify as white, but this is not a new idea. The first urban sociologist, W.E.B. Du Bois, coined a similar phrase at the turn of the 20th century after an extensive study of Black Philadelphia inequality, which also included the catchment of St. Peter Claver Parish. He called it the psychological wage of whiteness, or the payoffs that come with having white skin in a racialized society. Racism within the Catholic Church, especially what I call the spiritual wages of whiteness, or the payoffs that come with being Catholic in monolithic communities that reflect our racial identity in visual images, in leadership, in linguistic and liturgical styles, all gave rise to a sense that the common good is synonymous with being comfortable. This harkens us back to ideas of de facto racism. But racism within the church also links the common good to freedoms to protect the right to that comfortability. As the Sesqui plans were unfolding, for example, my German great-grandparents had arrived to Philadelphia from central Pennsylvania and landed in a Jesuit-run parish in North Philadelphia, gearing up for a 15-year, multi-pronged ecumenical effort to keep Black people out of the parish in the name of protecting the home, a building block of life and community, and the right to private property, a central principle of Catholic social teaching. Associating the common good with comfort, therefore, underscores a negative rather than positive understanding of human rights, by which I mean a sense that rights are freedoms from infringement of others rather than moral obligations we have to ensure each other's flourishing. In short, racism negatively impacted white Catholics' abilities to deal with discomfort and uncertainty in constructive ways, particularly discomfort around calls for racial justice and equity. And clearly that is something that we have inherited. White Catholics in the room have inherited that. To my mind, this is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of remembering the Sesqui. Dockery's impulse was to challenge the Klan's anti-Catholic rhetoric and violence, but not their even more threatening anti-Blackness. So memories of the Catholic Sesqui experience call to mind an uncomfortable truth that Catholic ethicist Brian Massengale is famous for saying: white comfort sets the limits on racial justice. This memory says we need to ask ourselves if it also sets the limits for the common good. So let me move to my final set of points, hopefully without, again, making you all so remembering. I want to close with a not so distant memory that further illuminates how Catholic racism has negatively impacted the way Catholics seek or achieve the common good, while also demonstrating how we can remember it. In the spring of 2017, not long after President Trump's inauguration, members of the Peace and Justice Committee in my parish, St. Vincent de Paul, wanted to hang a Black Lives Matter banner outside of the church. And I learned about this from a fellow parishioner, a Black Catholic named Chris. To my surprise, Chris was not entirely on board with this idea, and I was utterly confused as to why not. Not many, if any, Catholic parishes in Philadelphia had made that kind of commitment. And we at St. Vincent's were behind more progressive congregations of other faiths in our Germantown neighborhood. Perhaps most importantly, St. Vincent's was a recently merged parish, which now blends a politically progressive group of white Catholics who have transgressed the territorial boundaries of our home parishes and Black Catholics from two recently closed parishes in the neighborhood. What I learned from Chris points to the ways in which racism hijacks Catholics' abilities to build the common good. So first, Chris noted that the underlying motivation for hanging the banner, while certainly not ill-intending, was that the parish ought to do something for Black people, but not necessarily with them. Theologian Willie James Jennings has been a guide for me in understanding this paternalistic impulse as an expression of the missionary role that Christianity historically has played in the raising of people. According to Jennings, the missionary aligns the aims of imperialism, namely dominance, with the aims of the church, primarily salvation. The missionary does so by justifying the violence done to dark-skinned bodies in the name of saving their souls, forcing their assimilation to European ways of being and knowing, especially through instruction and ritual, and maintaining the status quo by meeting immediate need, but not addressing its root causes. So in short, racism within the church reduces the common good to a transactional relationship of goods and services to be distributed to those most in need, according to a moral calculus designed by those in the position to give in the first place. In other words, we associate building the common good primarily with acts of charity or service on behalf of those ostracized from life and community, rather than taking hard looks at the structures and systems that keep the marginalizing status quo in place. Without meaningful consultation with Black members of the parish or Black neighbors on the block, to Chris's mind, the banner was merely an extension of significant charity work the parish already does in its economically disadvantaged neighborhood on behalf of people made poor by structural racism. Second, Chris assumed that the audience for the banner, the public it was intended to engage, was an external audience rather than an internal one, in light of the urgency there was to put it up and a lack of consultation with Black members of the parish. To that end, the desire to raise the banner pointed to an understanding of the common good as a performance of identity, rather than as a relational commitment to a set of values at the heart of that identity. As we saw in the sesqui, racism within the church creates a sense that the common good is also something we perform or that we signal to express our righteousness or our moral superiority. But when not matched with commitments to living gospel values or regularly taking stock of whether or not people in our communities actually experience the values we profess in our communities, then those performances can be harmful. They sidestep historical awareness of and accountability for past wrongs. They make plain our blindness to the hypocrisies within our community. In the case of my parish, Chris was not sure that the desire to publicly affirm our Black lives of people we did not know matched an ongoing and unceasing commitment to affirming the Black lives of fellow parishioners in all of the ways that we attempt to do church together, from liturgy to leadership. Lastly, racism endures precisely because it's hard for those who benefit from it to detect it. Let me give you our last point here. A history of racism with the church blinds white Catholics to the assaults on the common good in our own communities and institutions. This is most evident, I think, in the reluctance of our institutional church here in the US to name racism as a form of structural sin perpetuated by the church itself, which wounds its people and undermines its moral authority in other efforts to build the common good. Racism reduces us into thinking that the common good is most threatened out there somewhere, and therefore needs to be bolstered or created out there. The history of racism in the church ensures that threats to the common good are much closer to home, or to put another way, that the common good is something that we are called to create right here. In my parish, Chris knew from his experience that Black Catholic lives did not necessarily matter within the parish. Our passion about resisting racism out there, coupled by our blindness to it right here, suggested to him a misaligned commitment to the common good. Fortunately for St. Vincent's, the story does not end there. Because as a parish, we had done some hard work together examining racism within the parish through a lay leadership group called the Reconciliation and Unity Ministry. And Chris and I were both members of that. And I can't help but think that that must have made my obliviousness to his concerns about this banner that much more painful for him. Chris was able to voice his objections to the banner and have them received by other parishioners on the Peace and Justice Committee willing to learn. And I can't help but think our curiosity rather than defensiveness extends from St. Vincent's ability and willingness to peruse its own history, right? And to engage in ways of thinking about the Catholic dimensions of the Black Lives Matter mantra, the Black Lives Matter anthem, the Black Lives Matter platform. So that would be the first thing. We engaged in a number of listening conversations, in some ways that predates Olga Segura's really important book on Catholics and the Black Lives Matter movement. The parish also doubled down on its commitment to faith-based community organizing. St. Vincent's is one of only 5 parishes out of a possible 200 across the diocese who are members of POWER. You heard about POWER earlier. And we're working to address the root causes of racial inequality in things like fair access to funding for public education, criminal justice, healthcare. The common good requires more than responding out of largesse, but in fact, naming and dismantling structures and systems and policies that narrow our understanding of life and community. Tackling root causes requires deep relational connections across the boundaries that racism creates. And I think we're going to hear more about that from Richard Wood in his discussion of the common good and organizing later today. And so then finally, we engaged in a lot of interesting creativity. And so I just want to show you some images. The parish just completed refurbishing frescoes in the sanctuary and side altars that had been water damaged. So now they are not only replete with a variety of holy and sainted Black Catholics, the Venerable Pierre Toussaint, Servant of God, Mother Mary Lange, Venerable Henriette de Lille, but also prophets for gender justice like Father Michael Judge, or economic justice like Oscar Romero, or prophets for the dignity of Black and Indigenous peoples like St. Catherine Drexel. There are also historical figures who are conduits for the common good in the parish community and its Germantown neighborhood, whose witness we risk forgetting when we also fail to remember the history of racism within the church. So surrounded by this cloud of witnesses not only builds us up for the work of creating together the common good, but it heightens our experience of it as we worship together as a multicultural community striving to ensure that all belong. So I'm going to leave you with this. In invoking the term common nearly 70 times in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis calls us to a new understanding of and commitment to the common good, indeed ourselves, that moves us beyond our own comfort. I'm going to quote him. A living and dynamic people, a people with a future, is one constantly open to a new synthesis through its ability to welcome differences. In this way, it does not deny its proper identity, but is open to being mobilized, challenged, broadened, and enriched by others, and thus to forward growth and development. In short, the common good is something we become together. Let's remember that. Thank you.
It is a privilege to participate this weekend and in this presentation. And I want to thank Professors Kelly Johnson and Vincent Miller and the organizers of the event for inviting me and to preparing such a good time. It's an honor to be a part of this weekend to recognize and celebrate Brother Ray Fitz. And more importantly, to substantially engage his vision and leadership and work and challenges that he gave us last night and through the years. I'm a beneficiary of Brother Ray's generosity, particularly when I was a young organizer. Well, not particularly young, but as an organizer, and making time available for me to come and talk with you, and give me the benefit of your wisdom and guidance and counsel. And more importantly, you look around this room and you see a lot of people who have had the benefit of that generosity. And in my work in the community, I hear the stories, and students like Maggie Schaller and others who have benefited from your mentorship. So thank you for investing in all of us, as well as for contributing to our community through people who have been shaped by you. And I appreciate the construct of regional solidarity, because I think that concept helps pull all this together, as Dr. O'Connell has helped us to start thinking about. And I'm thankful for you, Dr. O'Connell, as I've engaged your thought previous to this, but here, and your framework is very helpful, and to explore how we work for the common good in a divided world, country, culture, and in particular our city, Dayton. One caveat, engaging with Catholic theology takes me back to a transcultural experience I had in Australia in 1992. On that occasion, I remember that feeling a bit awkward, because while we spoke the same language, we didn't have the same experience, context, and culture. And so I felt a bit like a bull in a china shop. And so as a Protestant here among Catholics, I feel a bit like a bull in a china shop. But it's not a new experience for me. At one time, I was the executive director of Greater Dayton Christian Connections, and got to to work with many Catholic leaders in that time, including Lou Bear and Corey Thibodeau, who were leaders in the community at that time. And so I thank you for inviting this Protestant into this Catholic conversation. I think this discussion you're framing with Dr. O'Connell around remember and remembering, and the introduction to the concept of dangerous memories and the exploration of common good is very helpful. And I'm particularly intrigued by the process of remember and remembering, for it reminds me of reading Paul Ricoeur in his book on time and narrative. And in that book, he talks about how memory is a creative process of how we make identity and meaning. And so it's intriguing how you've moved from remember and remembering, remember being a primary kind of cognitive act, to remembering, which is a relational act. And so thinking about how those go together, how our thought and our relationships merge in that process of remember and remembering, and how to build regional solidarity. And it's not only dangerous memories that can interrupt one's story. A new diagnosis or a tragic accident disrupt too. And so as a chaplain, I have found that this process of helping people remember their story and to recraft it in new ways can be both healing and transformative, especially when they are able to weave into their story the deep stories of their faith, right? Like compassion, forgiveness, hope, the love of God, the good news of the gospel woven into our stories. And I think that's really what you're challenging us today to do, is how do we weave in the deep stories of our Christian faith into that remember and remembering process. So our ability to tell stories is both important at a psychological level and a theological level. My experience that we are all multi-story, if you will. We have several stories. For instance, I have a story about what it means to be a man, an American, a chaplain, a white person, a father, a person in a wheelchair, an athlete. Some of these stories align well. Others are not so harmonious. And we have to create a space for us to think about our stories about being Christian, particularly a Catholic, an American, a follower of Jesus, a neighbor, a white person, a black person. Your three examples are powerful interruptions and provides a space to remember in new ways. I'd like to start my theological concept, thinking around a construct that I learned from a professor at United Theological Seminary. I don't know if many of you had the opportunity to meet Dr. Andrew Sung Park. He's a kindred spirit of Brother Fitz. When I interact with them, I have the same experience of their humility, their wisdom, their contributions, their expression of faith. Dr. Park has written books on racism and reconciliation, and acknowledges to your process of remember and remembering. And in his work, he introduced me to this Korean concept of Han. And he uses that construct to help us think about salvation in a more full and comprehensive way. Han doesn't translate well into English. My best understanding is that Han is the legacy of sin. From my perspective, it is an important corrective to our current understanding of how God's grace works. Dr. Park then examines the prevalent understanding of salvation in U.S. Protestant theology. That salvation is conceived as between a person and God. The individual repents and God forgives. Psalm 51 is isolated, if you will. Against you only I have sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified when you speak and blameless when you judge. So that the work of God's grace is limited into this individualistic interaction or even transaction. And even the observance, the silence, if you will, of those who are harmed by the sin and individually or the community collectively is ignored. So this formula reduces a dynamic relation of mutuality to an individual transaction. And if I'm not mistaken, and so left undressed are the harm of the individual and no means of restitution or process of reconciliation. And if I'm not mistaken, that might be what some of you call penance. And us Protestants don't have a lot of language around penance, but I think we have something to learn out of that. Dr. Park then advances the concepts of restorative justice being necessary to understand salvation, confession and forgiveness, and right relationships in a holistic way. One of Dr. Park's examples is a dangerous memory and may help our understanding. The Japanese army sex trafficked and sexually exploited South Korean women prior and during World War II. Euphemistically, these women were known as comfort women. Once the war was over, these women returned to their homes but lived in shame. An interesting side note, just this week, the governments of South Korea and Japan had a diplomatic dispute. South Korea filed a formal diplomatic protest against Japan for how it teaches about the comfort women in the elementary school. The South Koreans noted that they downplayed the coercive nature of the sex trafficking. Yeah, you can probably see parallels. Oh, and one parallel is I appreciate that you didn't say white Protestants when you talked about the Klan, which is an unspoken truth. And it reminds me of an interesting story here about unspoken histories. There was a story circle that went around. I probably learned about this from you, Brother Ray, when I was the director of Greater Dayton's Christian Connection. They were collecting stories around people's experience with race. And then there was a playwright who had collected those stories and wrote them into little vignettes. And there's one vignette that still I'm remembered of, and it was a story about Old North Dayton, where I work now at Dayton Children's. And there was a parrot in the neighborhood. And the parrot could recognize a Jew, a Catholic, and a Black, and had pejorative words for each of them as they would walk by. Oh. And it was the first time that, I'm in my 20s, and I've lived in Dayton my whole life, the first time I had realized around the anti-Catholicism that had been present in my community, but which that story we have not told. And then later on, I learned that my grandfather had been Catholic and married a Protestant woman and had been somewhat ostracized from the family, sanctions, which we'll talk a little bit later, because of that, that type of discrimination that was present. So stories that weren't told. So I can't recall now exactly how Dr. Park makes this distinction between shame and guilt. I think that distinction is important, partly from a pastoral theologian, John Patton, who distinguishes shame and guilt this way. Guilt is when I've committed a sin, and shame is when I've been diminished by another's actions. And for years, these South Korean women have lived without any acknowledgement, and that shame has impacted their physical, mental health, and their relationships and their ability to participate in society, and I would say their spiritual well-being. And so Han includes that shame and unaddressed sin and the lack of justice. And Brother Ray, I was thinking of your comments last night, and you talking about how the experience of the violence of poverty impacts your prayer life, your well-being, your sense. I would say that that's probably an experience of Han, unaddressed injustice and sin. I would also say it's probably an experience of conscience. And it seems like we are in a place, and I'll say a little bit more about this, where we don't want our conscience to work on us for transformative, that we want to hold our conscience and that disease that comes with conscience to a side. And so I think this concept of Han helps this conversation, and the principles of restorative justice are helpful for our process of remember and remembering. From your childhood story, I find your description of your return to the comfort of your own bed both honest and convicting. It makes me pause to reflect on all the times I've been able to return to comforts of white spaces. This is where I get teary. Sorry. My daughter turns 12 this month. And I think of that young 10 or 12-year-old and how she experienced that moment. She's both a victim of racism exposed to trauma with no means to prevent, stop, or mitigate it, and also a beneficiary of racism, having a safe place when others do not. But because of her own but not because of her own actions. She's in a place of shame. I remember in the midst of COVID, there was a mother who was talking to a friend, mother talking about their child. Their child was complaining about not feeling right. And the mom checked her out physically and everything, and just told her, it's nothing to go on. But I knew exactly what that was. The girl had a pit in her stomach. She was experiencing the injustice of the world, and there was no language for her to express it. And I think many of our kids experience what the hymnists would call a sin-sick soul, living in a sin-sick culture. And so I appreciate on an individual level, seeing your scholarship and your work in your parish is an act of faith and of remembering in your own way for that 12-year-old who was exposed to that expression of honor. And in the midst of this, I think we should, look around, a lot of white people here. So I think it's helpful to, as we talk about race, to recognize that the discussion of race can be uncomfortable, even unsettling for some white brothers and sisters. Robin DiAngelo has described his experience as white fragility. And briefly, the discussion of race activates an emotional response within whites. Using the lens of harm, we can imagine that people are experiencing the legacy of sin, shame and guilt, unreconciled relationships, injustice and evil. Interesting research out of the field of social work suggests that our reactions of race are akin to our reactions of trauma, and that they occur at a precognitive stage. And so we think that we're going to kind of educate and teach our way out of the experience of race, but people have already been activated, their fight mechanism and their defense mechanisms are being activated before the conversation can move to a place where you can think about it. And once those defense mechanisms become activated, it's very hard to move in a constructive process of remembering. I think her construct is helpful in terms of description. Hopefully those of you who are here today have come in a place where you're able to get beyond that initial reaction and engage in conversation. And if you haven't, I can imagine this conversation feels like being thrown into the deep end and not knowing how to swim. But I want to encourage you that there are people around you who are lifeguards and can help you navigate these turbulent waters. And I also want to recognize that white and black's experiences are different. Maybe you've seen that meme of the young girl who had integrated schools in Alabama. I forget how old she is. She's a 10th grade age. And in the meme says, if she can experience it, your child can learn about it. Mm-hmm. And so the disparity of how we can engage this topic is illustrated painfully in that way. Hopefully in the midst of saying that we can find a way to extend grace to everyone, to invite them into the conversation and be able to participate. In the midst of that Philadelphia story of the bombing, it makes me, so we talked about the personal level, at the structural level. I'm curious how Philadelphia's neighborhoods got structured the way they did. I suspect it's a lot similar to the way Dayton's neighborhoods got structured, because there were federal policies and lending practices that developed them that were at a national level. And in your program books, you can see some of that. And many of you have seen probably the undesigned red line exhibit that just closed this week. But you can also, if you haven't, you can still see the Think TV documentary, the exhibit, redlining mapping inequality in Dayton and Springfield. And that lays out this story of the federal policies that drew the lines where investment would occur and not occur. And when you look through those graphics in your program book, you can see the incredible correlation between those neighborhoods that were defined redlined in 1930 to the places of where investment and disinvestment occur, poverty and wealth is located, health and illness, and educational opportunities and none. And so those have shaped Dayton in profound ways. And then Dayton's population started to recede in the late 50s, around 1960, census, we see it. And so the process of urban sprawl had already begun before mandatory busing began when I was in 5th grade in 1975. And certainly that mandatory busing sped up that urban sprawl. But the urban sprawl was abetted by racist policies and housing and lending and access to capital to invest in. And Brother Ray, I remember sitting with you probably 15 years ago when you were doing your presentations on urban sprawl and pointing out that Dayton's population, the region's population, has stayed relatively flat, and yet we've grown 4 to 5 times. And so, just a caveat as a Dayton City Commissioner, one of the reasons we have trouble funding all our infrastructure is we have the same number of people trying to fund 5 times the amount of roads and sewer lines and police and fire coverage. And what they tell me, the administrators tell me, is that it doesn't go 1-to-1 cost when you go from 1 to 2 to 3, but it's exponential. And so the costs get higher and higher. So red line is dangerous memory. Our geography has been significantly shaped by this injustice. You can see it in those graphic illustrations in your program and that high correlation. And then, in Dayton, in Ohio, we have this, what's been ruled unconstitutional funding of schools, public schools. We have a constitutional requirement to provide public education at the state level, but the state relies on property taxes. And the redlining legacy comes over again, and those, where your zip code determines the quality of the school you're going to be in. And I would also say that the legacy of busing had another impact, which was it completely disrupted all our neighborhoods. And so right now we have and most of the city neighborhoods are very fractured because you don't have that school, which was a place where people came together and built a common good together and built those deep relationships that make a community work. Brother Ray had seen that, and we've got 6 community schools that seek to address that. So this legacy of redlining, and you can mention where I-675 is located, now the new Austin Road interchanges, federal dollars being used. I'm mindful of some of you may have participated in LEAD when LEAD was trying to prevent buses, public transportation to Beaver Creek was trying to prevent public transportation from access to a significant area of commerce and retail and healthcare. The only way they were able to open that up was that the federal dollars that were used to create that interchange required access to everyone. And it was through the Department of Transportation recognizing that Beaver Creek was in jeopardy if they didn't provide the access via public transportation. And in this moment, we have $138 million coming to Dayton from federal dollars, and it's still impacted by this kind of redlining because we're not able to use that 138 simply to address the issues that had happened with COVID, but we have to invest to the disinvestment in some of our neighborhoods that exacerbated the experience of COVID, particularly thinking about people who live in unstable and unsafe housing. And so a lot of our dollars, $55 million, are set aside to invest in our neighborhoods to try to improve housing. That is the legacy to that redlining. I appreciate your conversation around the Black Lives Matter decision in the current parish. It reminds us that the work on racism is ongoing. And I think it's a hopeful example of how people, white and black, can engage the substantial common work, transcend the legacy of racism, and advance the remembering work. It also reminded me of Kennedy's definition of race, of whether one is racist or non-racist. And his definition is quite simply, if you're working to undo racism, then you're an anti-racist. And if you're not, then you are a racist. It's interesting that he de-racializes that and moves it away from skin color, which is often the way we think about how racism is defined. I think there's a pro and con to that. There's a pro in that it invites everyone into the work. And it reminds me of something I observed in Martin Luther King's writings. Martin Luther King, if we're not looked at his writings in the spoken word, I haven't found an occasion where he demonized, vilifies, or others white people. And I think that's instructive. But rather, he would talk about the evil of racism, and that in that way it invited people in to address the evil. The downside of that is it runs the risk of us to evade the actual racial dynamics that are in the midst of any work we're doing. In that work, one of the key things I saw from a community organizer is that kind of work that you did, that remembering kind of work that was constructive, only occurs in relationship. You can't agitate someone that you're not in a relationship. Agitate being a community organizing word, but to help move transformation. And it seems like dangerous memories have the potential for transformation, but outside of relationship, they can be divisive. And so you can start kind of thinking through how we're seeing examples of that play out in our community. And I think we're in a place where we could have parallel realities and parallel stories, where people are not in relationship. And so those stories about race and how race occurs and how racism is enacted or corrected, how it should be taught, are in these very parallel stories. And it's hard to build that regional solidarity when we have these parallel realities because we're not in relationships. And I think that's a challenge for us. At one time we had the Dayton dialogue on race relationships that work to bring people across some of these boundaries and conversation. And we let that work go away. It might be time to revisit that. And I want to talk about the balance between charity and justice. A friend had a tweet that said, rather than teaching our kids resilience, maybe we should work on building a world that's less traumatic. Yes. And so you can see that maybe we need to do more on the justice side, and we might not have to do as much on the charity side. And being in Dayton, I know the great work that Catholic Social Services does, and there's a great investment into there. But there's some places like practices around adoption, policies around adoption. There are the insufficient funds the federal government provides for refugee resettlement, and how we have to work within that have disparate impacts on some of our most vulnerable people. And so how do we bring that justice work to the forefront more so it balances out our mercy work? And when I think of justice work, I think that I can't love all my neighbors in a complex society, but I can work for justice, which becomes love enacted. And I think some of the scholars, Catholic scholars, have been working on rounding out the common good to that understanding of justice. I will share with you in the baptism covenant liturgy of the Methodist Church, when we renounce sin and profess our faith, we have these questions put to sponsors or the candidate. On behalf of the whole church, I ask you, do you renounce the spiritual forces of wickedness, reject the evil powers of this world, and repent of your sin? That probably sounds familiar. And then this one, do you accept the freedom and power God gives you to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves? My wife's a pastor, so she likes to remind me of that one when I'm not my best self. And that leads me kind of to my last point. Theology Matters. And I'm thinking of Cardinal Doherty. And it reminded me of reading, it's been a long time, how the Irish became white. And there's a complex history there and multiple factors, some even global. And, but there was the first thing I want to say is that there's a process of sanctioning that occurs. And it happens, and I saw it most clearly, there's an African-American scholar who has looked at how abusers control the women they abuse. And he took those 4 ways and applied it to how whites control blacks. And I would even extend it to those who attempt to be allies can also be controlled the same. or 26. The taking away or barriers to financial or the prevention of social capital. And at the time this scholar wrote, we didn't have this term, but what we would now call gaslighting, that you would try to help people, convince people that what their reality was not their reality. And I think you can see elements, all of that in Cardinal Doherty, and it's hard to imagine how he was navigating the threats of violence to him personally, to others, to Catholics, what it means, and then the stories, right? What does it mean to be American, be white, be Catholic? And so then I want to bring this back to where theology matters. We're really talking about how people are formed. And my experience when I was in the local church was that I might have gotten an hour on Sunday, maybe an hour midweek, maybe folks were praying daily. And, you know, they're watching news a lot more and engaging in social media a lot more. And so they are being formed more as conservatives or liberals or Americans than they were their own faith. And so how do we, as a church, do formation in a different way, in a stronger way, so that we move the core of the gospel into their formation, and that deep story that really gives life becomes their story that informs all the other stories. And in this conversation, I've thought about, how do we center the common good? Because my experience of social justice in the Protestant church, but also in my interaction with the Catholic Church, is social justice is over here somewhat segregated away from the full life of the church and not seen as integral to what it means. And I would put it kind of back to that, take it back to Andrew Park and his understanding. Because if you have a salvation that's individual and transactional, you don't have a formation that helps you see that salvation is relational and comprehensive and holistic. And then this is just a Protestant here being ignorant. But why common good? That sounds like a secular philosophical term. As a city commissioner, it makes sense to me. It's that language. But as a Protestant theologian, I think around King's beloved community, or the kingdom of God, the reign of God, and all that's problematic. I think there's, if you think about living in a democracy and we don't have a king, but we're responsible like a king, and what does the good king do? It's the provision of a community that is healthy and generative for all citizens. I think there's currency there. Or even if we went back to our Jewish roots, to shalom, and that comprehensive notion of wellness. So that's just the Protestant being a bit provocative, I guess. Thanks.